here with Abigail Shrier, and I am so excited to talk to you about your new book right here. I was so excited to get it, and I have to tell you, looking through this was like revisiting the last year of my life. Every chapter was like, oh yes, and I learned that, and I learned that, because I think, like a lot of us, we didn't know that this was going on until fairly recently.
Yeah, it really, social media takes phenomena that would be small and it really makes them geometrically explode. So I think social media did that with this too.
Well, and one of the things that I thought was interesting is that it sounds like you and I actually both got interested in this for the same reason, but coming from different angles. So
Okay.
I'm not sure how much you know about my background, but I got involved with it because I was a trans kid, and they introduced legislation in Utah that would have actually banned the very therapy that helped me resolve my gender dysphoria.
Right.
And so I decided to start speaking out about it. It sounds like there was legislation that was concerning to you, and that's how you got involved in it.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so yes, that's true broadly, but it was it was obviously from a different angle. So I didn't actually uh, think I was going to get involved in this at all, because I just wrote about I wrote a piece about the misgendering laws in California and New York. So there are laws that assign criminal and civil penalties if you misgender someone in California and New York. And I just pointed out that's unconstitutional. I wrote a piece arguing that's unconstitutional because in America, the government can't make people say anything. It's actually a pretty straightforward legal argument. The government's really not allowed to make people say anything at all in America. But a reader wrote to me, and she told me her story about how her daughter had gotten caught up in this. A girl with no history of gender dysphoria, no history of discomfort in her body. And she wanted me to take it on. And I actually passed her off to another investigative reporter. I'm not an investigative reporter, and I actually didn't necessarily want anything to do with this because I thought, wow, this is really out of my sort of area of expertise. But when she told me she had trouble getting anyone to take this up, and she had written to a lot of journalists. So when I tried to pass it off, I realized she was right, that journalists did not want to take on this issue. And so after I waited a few months, I got back in touch with her, and I said, all right, let me talk to some of your contacts. And it turned out she was right. This was all over the country, all over the West, in fact.
Well, and it's really shocking. I don't think people realize how insidious it is, and how we really do have 13-year-old girls who are getting their breasts amputated, and 8-year-old children who are being put on cross-sex hormones. And to me, this is just incredibly disturbing, because I know if I had been alive today, I would be one of those kids. My therapist wouldn't have been able to help me alleviate my gender dysphoria. They would have affirmed to me and told me that I really was a boy. And so I think, I suspect you're coming from the same place I am, as this horrifying realization of what's happening.
I get contacted by so many women who say just that. I know your story is, particularly rich and interesting and very poignant, but I get emails from so many women who say something similar, which is that I was a tomboy, and this could have been me. And I think that, I certainly feel that way. I was a tomboy, and, I was good at sports, and, and I preferred, I'd always had a lot of friends who were boys and whatnot. And the idea that young girls, especially troubled girls in puberty, girls with already who are suffering anxiety and depression, are being told, actually, if you're not a perfectly feminine, whatever that means, you're really a boy. And listening to it, unfortunately, it's really disturbing.
Well, and I just actually listened to an interview with Joanna Allison Kennedy, who's one of the sort of at the forefront of this movement. And she talks about boy-bodied people and girl-bodied people. And it just really, I found it so offensive, because she basically said that if a girl-bodied person did something that didn't conform to gender stereotypes, they were gender nonconforming and likely transgender. And it just blows me away that a child who is not conforming to these rigid social stereotypes that we tried so hard to get away from for so many years is now being told that there's actually something inherently wrong with them, that they were born in the wrong body, and that they should transition.
That's right. I mean, I think it's disturbing to a lot of us, a lot of women out there, and I include myself in this, that all of a sudden, the more remarkable you are as a woman, the more break boundaries and do engage in, all kinds of, you know, areas of excellence or interest that are not, stereotypically feminine, that somehow makes you less of a woman is such an insulting, you know, um, way a gloss on what otherwise should be an area of celebration.
Well, and one of the things that I find also disturbing is that the males who are transitioning are embracing these very outdated ideas of what it means to be a woman, and basically want to have, big breasts and makeup and hair, and that sort of is how they're defining themselves. And I actually talked to Ken Zucker. I think it was last week, and I asked him, if you had a woman who was flat chested, or maybe had, some hair growth on her face, and she was very uncomfortable about it, or maybe she was kind of, masculine looking and wanted facial feminization surgery, and if this woman was concerned about it, would she be able to access surgeries paid for by insurance companies? And he said that they would likely be labeled as having OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which I thought was really interesting. So if a woman wants to have these surgeries that make her conform more to our standards of beauty, she would have OCD. But if a man wants to do it, then he gets sort of told, celebrated. He gets told he's actually a woman, and insurance companies and sometimes Medicaid will cover that.
Or how about this? I talked to a really brilliant young man who transitioned to being a woman, or went through some medical transition, regretted it, and wanted to have procedures to go back. He had the orchiectomy, which is the testicle removal, and it was a very confused period of his life. And even as a young person, still regretted it. So he was, I guess, in his mid 20s by the time he regretted it, or mid to late 20s by the time he regretted it. And he pointed out that all the hormones and surgeries had been covered by insurance, but the moment he realized he had made a mistake and wanted to recover his sort of biological manhood, they weren't covered. They were incredibly expensive now.
Well, and that's happening. I've talked to a lot of detransitioners that have the same experience, that, they were pushed and celebrated and encouraged to move forward with transitions. But then when they detransitioned, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Walt Heyer's story, but he had a full sex change operation. And last I talked to him, he still hadn't been able to get his records changed back to his original birth sex in California. And I don't know if that's still the case, but it's incredibly difficult to go back to where you were, but incredibly easy to go to something that you're not.
Yes, and the young man that the man that I referred to, I don't know if I should say young anymore. He's now a little bit older, and he's still like maybe early 30s. It's young to me, and he said to me, maybe he's late 20s or early 30s. I'm not remembering his exact age at the moment, but he said to me, one of the things that was so hard when he transitioned was that the fact that it was covered made it so easy, sort of. In other words, not only easy, but he didn't put as much thought about what the sacrifice was involved. He said, but when something's expensive, it makes you really think about, do I really want this? And unfortunately, one of the side effects of so many of these surgeries getting fast-tracked and easily covered, our colleges now cover under their regular student health plans, all kinds of hormones, even surgeries for this, is that it really doesn't encourage young people caught up in this sudden enthusiasm to take a moment and think about whether this is something they really want.
Well, and I thought it was really interesting. You talked about when a woman starts taking testosterone, she gets like this euphoria that it's a boost, and it can help with depression, it can help with anxiety, and initially they feel really good. And so it's not surprising it's a social contagion, because you have, a girl who might be struggling, and then she says, gosh, I went to the health center and I got testosterone. I feel awesome. And especially if you have maybe body image issues. You mentioned fat redistribution. There are a lot of us who are uncomfortable with where our fat is. And so it's not surprising to me that this has caught on in a way. What's surprising to me is that doctors are just going with it.
Yeah, they are. I think that's right. The testosterone has because it delivers euphoria, because it is, it's a Schedule 3 controlled substance. it delivers euphoria, and it controls, it suppresses anxiety, which is these girls' biggest problem. The young women who are part of this epidemic, and it is an epidemic, the rates are so high in teen girls now identifying as trans and wanting these. It suppresses their anxiety. So sometimes these girls feel better than they have felt in ages. And and one of the worst parts about that is that they feel better, and they see it as when they go on testosterone, they see it as confirmation. Oh, that's right. Oh, I was right. My problem was that I was in a woman's body. Of course, that's only because it's suppressing the anxiety, right? It's because it's controlling their other mental health problems. These girls most often don't have typical gender dysphoria at all. But they think when they go on T, they feel so great. They can't wait to tell their friends, and they see the rush they get as confirmation that that was really their problem.
Which is, it's almost like suggesting someone take heroin. If you're not feeling very good, go ahead, take heroin, you're going to feel better. And yet in the long term, we know that that's not a good solution to anxiety. And it just occurs to me that we've raised this whole generation of children who are so fragile that anxiety is triggering them. And then once they transition, being misgendered, being called the wrong name triggers them. And it just feels like, we as older adults are almost held hostage by the fragility of this generation.
I think that's an amazing point. It's true. And it really gets to the heart of this phenomenon. And that is, we're going to be seeing so many ramifications of having raised the most fragile generation on record. Their pain is real. They are having severe anxiety attacks, all kinds of depression, suicidal ideation. There's a wonderful, I think, Irish, I want to say, therapist, Stella O'Malley, I believe her name is. And she talks about, she has actually a wonderful video now on anxiety and the ways that we talk about anxiety so much with our kids. We are creating a mental health obsessed generation that feels no agency for its own, in its ability to overcome things, and is obsessed with the idea that they have ADHD, depression, anxiety, panic attacks, any kind of stress. I mean, I see this all over. I'll give you a personal example of this, okay? A couple of years ago, my kids' school, they were going to start their first standardized test. It was a routine test. And they recommended that all the parents, maybe it wasn't a year or two ago, recommended that all the parents send a note to the children, encouraging them in case they felt nervous about taking a test. Now, of course, that is, I know from the research I did for this book, that is the worst thing you could do, is to introduce the idea that tests produce anxiety, because what you're likely to get is a bunch of kids with so-called testing anxiety.
That just is astounding to me. And I'm laughing, but it's really sad because I see it everywhere. I see these kids, and then they're medicated, and the number of kids, young kids even, who are getting antidepressants and antipsychotics now is just shocking. And I've had a few parents talk to me who are wondering if there's a connection between the antidepressants and antipsychotic use and then feeling transgender, because these antipsychotic medications, these antidepressants, lower your sex drive. And so kids who, and I also think it's sort of, it allows you to dissociate more from your body because you're not feeling those feelings that you're supposed to be feeling. And they also learn that medicine is the answer.
So I think everything you just said is very interesting, and it's that's right. I mean, I think of a few things. You said so many interesting things. First of all, there's no question that this phenomenon is really about feeling uncomfortable in your body, but it's really not about transitioning to a man's body. These girls aren't interested generally in becoming men. They don't pursue phalloplasty. Almost none of them get phalloplasty. Very small numbers get phalloplasty. And most of them have no interest in phalloplasty. Most people who are actually interested in becoming men would consider a penis somewhat important, right? So they don't even adopt the stereotypic habits of men. They don't try to seem like men, these particular of girls who have sudden onset, rapid onset gender disorder. So it's not about becoming an actual man or seeming like a man, and it's not about sex either. These are a largely asexual population. A large number of them are not interested in sex, have not had sex, and are not having sex. And while they go through this, testosterone and various surgeries, they will report, in interviews I've done, they will report to feeling more dysphoria. In other words, more uncomfortable. So what they want then is the next surgery. But what they don't want is for someone to see them naked or to touch someone or to touch them. So it's not, it certainly is about distress in your body and feeling detachment from your body. And it certainly does have an element of asexuality to it. And then the third thing you said, which I thought was also amazing, was that, I'm trying to remember, the third thing you said was that, that the habit, it creates a habit of being certain. All this medicalization encourages the habit of feeling like there's something really wrong with me mentally. Kids who are going through what used to be sort of humdrum things, that doesn't mean they weren't painful, but humdrum, loss of a pet, loss of a grandparent, even, boy or girl not liking you back. These are traumas for this generation, absolute traumas. And I think all those things are combining to make these a very sort of troubled group.
Well, and one of the things that I actually am part of the Compassion Coalition. It's a group that I organized to bring together people who are concerned about the medicalization of these kids' gender dysphoria, and trying to stop people from pushing forward with medicalization, medical treatments of these kids. And a lot of them are parents or friends of boys who are experiencing rapid onset gender dysphoria. And your book very specifically focuses on girls. Is there any chance that you'll do another book looking at boys?
I've been asked that. I don't know. My book originally had a chapter on the boys. I didn't write the book about the boys for a very important reason. And that important reason is we know that this is atypical gender dysphoria because it's now overwhelmingly dominated by a demographic that has never experienced gender dysphoria in any significant numbers, and they don't resemble, and they have no childhood history of gender dysphoria. Okay, the boys are a more complicated case. So they are a very interesting group, but they are more complicated. The number one reason is because gender dysphoria has always afflicted some number of boys. So unlike the girls who do not seem to have typical gender dysphoria at all, they seem to have other mental health problems, some number of the boys whose parents believe they have rapid onset gender dysphoria, some number of them may just be autogonophilic or other things. They may be typical, more typical presentations of gender dysphoria. However, I would say that I personally have listened to the accounts of parents and who tell me that they believe their son has rapid onset gender dysphoria. I think there's something that really has to be investigated there. Whether I'm going to be the one to do it, I don't know yet what my next book will be on, but I think it really is worthy of study whether these boys, because there are some indications that what they're going through is not typical, or what many of them are going through is not typical gender dysphoria either.
Well, and I also think some people, it's harder to track these boys because testosterone, like you said, it's a reportable medication, and so the health departments know how many kids are getting it. Estrogen is actually pretty easily available online, and so we may not have really good numbers for how many boys are experiencing rapid onset gender dysphoria.
What's hard about the boys is that. First of all, some of them do seem to be set off by social media, meaning that social media has played a part in some of their transitions. And some of them are, no doubt, from what I understand, from what I've heard from parents, that they seem to be doing this in order to be part of the LGBT community. I've heard stories where a boy had a crush on a girl or had a girlfriend for a year or two, was totally in love with him. She dumped him to become trans, and then he decided he was trans too. I mean, you hear stories like that where you think, gosh, that doesn't sound like typical gender dysphoria. typical gender dysphoria is not pursued by people who are looking to make friends. That's a new thing. So I do think it's a really, really interesting phenomenon and really worth a lot of study.
So I'm just curious, as someone who's spoken out about this locally, I've gotten a lot of pushback. My son, who was I think 13 at the time, came home and said that somebody met him at the bus stop and said, you know, there's people in Logan who want to kill your mom because of what she's doing. And I've had threats of physical violence for speaking out about my story. And I was just wondering if you've had any pushback like that.
Yes, I would say yes. I don't like to talk about it. I don't like to talk about it because I don't want to give anyone the false impression that they are winning or that they will intimidate me.
Well, and I think that's great. I mean, that's kind of how I've responded too. Is I'm not going to let anybody bully me into silence, and I think that's how a lot of parents are feeling right now. I know Lynn Meager, who's a mother who had some kids who went down this path, has been sort of ruthlessly bullied, and she's not stepping down. And so I appreciate your wanting to stay firm.
I mean, look, I'll talk to anybody. I've talked to all, as long as it's cordial, I've talked to all kinds of people. Transgender adults reach out to me all the time who are really lovely in all professions, doctors, every kind, and not the activists, the most extreme activists. I certainly have trouble speaking to in a cordial way. It seems not, for some reason, that seems to not to be their, their modus operandi. But, everyone else I'm able to talk to in a very cordial way. And I will just say that, I'm, as a journalist, I'm always interested in talking to everyone. So I definitely, love to have, and I have learned a lot from people who, were coming at this from a different perspective. So I'm always open for conversation, but I do think, these efforts to silence and shut it down and cancel are really ugly. And I think they should be opposed across the board by everyone who seeks, any attempts to shut conversation down really should meet with a lot of opprobrium.
Before you go, I wondered if you could um, give some advice as to how people can fight against this, because like in California, based on what you wrote, it sounds like high school kids can get permission to go off campus to get cross-sex hormones without parental permission. I'm not sure if that is currently taking place or if that's just legislation that was introduced.
So what I reported on was I was able to get documentation and show that the California Teachers Association, one of the largest public school unions, had come out in favor, had voted to adopt this proposal, voted for this proposal to allow this. And then the follow-up vote that they had, that was in June of 2019. And then they had a follow-up vote on that in January of 2020, in which they endorsed having on-campus, meaning, public school campus health clinics around Los Angeles for both transgender and cisgender youth to receive their medications in a confidential manner. So these clinics are absolutely opening up across LA County. It's one of the largest public school conglomerates in the country. One of school districts in the country. It's very large. And we're seeing, I think their plans are to open 50 clinics. So I have not had confirmation that testosterone is being offered there. But I am taking the California Public, Teachers Association at its word that that's what they would like to see.
And who pays for this? I mean, these are very expensive treatments.
It's a very good question.
And that's one of the, as someone who I used to affiliate as a liberal, I'm not sure what I am anymore, but this thriving to take care of people, so that, to make sure people get essential medical services, and to know that money is being spent for these tremendously expensive medical interventions, while at the same time there are people who are really struggling just to get, insulin or other really important medical treatments. So it's coming from somewhere. There's funding for this somewhere. And
I have not looked into the funding.
Okay.
Other people have done that. I was really just interested in the cultural and mental health phenomena of these girls.
So
affecting these girls.
based on your research, if you were talking to someone who had girls maybe, almost middle school age, what would you tell them?
Oh, a number of things. First of all, if they're middle school age, to get and keep their daughters off social media. There's all kinds of research connecting social media to anxiety and depression in our especially young girls. We're seeing spikes we've never seen before among teenage girls of suicidal ideation and self-harm. It's very serious stuff, and they are able to link it to social media. The constant competition, the constant comparing, the constant feeling less than is really harming them in mental health. And it also gives them access to all kinds of bad influences, like the transgender influencers, some of whom are quite bad influences on young people, and very confusing influences. So I would say get them off social media if you can do that. Another thing is to oppose gender ideology in the school. There's no reason we can't show compassion for transgender children without indoctrinating an entire student body in gender confusion. The number of parents I talk to who tell me their daughters first had this epiphany about being transgender after seeing a school presentation is quite significant. They're going into, I track this in my book, and they're going into the schools so aggressively to sow confusion in this population. I don't know if they want to sow confusion, but that's the effect. So we're ending up with a lot of gender confused kids because of it. And then the last thing I would say, and there are many recommendations in the book, but the last one that I want to mention that I think is really important is to remember to set limits and be the parent. Unfortunately, I'm part of Gen X, and I'm very proud of Gen X, but we do tend to want to be friends with our kids, and are so protective of our close relationship with our daughters that we never want to upset them. And sometimes doing something in their best interest make them really upset with you. They may even claim to hate you for a while, but of course, being the parent and setting limits is a really important part of your job.
Well, and I think the social media aspect is important because one of the things that you sort of touched on, I don't know how much information you got about this, but it seemed like at least some of the peak trans young women, peak resilience young women, really felt like they had been groomed to be sexualized, as well as to embrace this transgender ideology, but also to be sexualized, and that is really concerning because I think anytime kids don't have clear boundaries about their personal space, it makes them vulnerable to all kinds of things. And I wasn't sure if you found that sort of across the board, or if that was just sort of something that occasionally happened.
I've heard about it a lot from detransitioners. That means, young women who transitioned medically and then regretted it and came and tried to transition back, or worked, underwent, either procedures or hormones to go back. That is, from what I understand, far too common. And that is that you make an announcement online about yourself, whether it's transgender or anything else, about your sexuality or gender identity, and you'll be celebrated, and you'll be contacted by adults, many of whom do not have your best interest in mind. And so that I have heard, that is a story I've heard a lot. It's deeply troubling. And parents who go along with this will say to me sort of, well, I'm trying to support my LGBT child. That's why I allowed her to make this announcement. And I always say to them, would you take your 14-year-old daughter to a mixer with 30-year-old men? Because that's what you're doing when you're allowing her to announce herself at 14 as trans online. You're allowing her into contact with all kinds of adults who have, may have sexual interest in her.
Well, and that's really disturbing. And it also kind of harkens back to the whole transgender ideology that's happening in our schools, in that we now, it's because of this ideology, we now have kids in kindergarten talking about vaginas and penises in a way that I certainly didn't when I was in kindergarten, and my kids didn't. And we have potentially we have kindergarten boys going into the girls' bathrooms, and there's just almost a breaking down of those boundaries that I think we used to have, as well as consent, because girls aren't allowed to say that they're uncomfortable having a biological male in their spaces without being labeled as transphobic.
There's something very troubling going on in that teachers seem so eager to do everything other than their job And why that is, I don't know, but they've taken on this other responsibility, which is, their radical gender, encouraging everyone to their radical view of gender, which is, you would think would be reserved for someone who was making sure all the students already are ahead in reading and math and whatnot. But instead, they seem more interested in doing that than doing their actual jobs. It's really disturbing.
It is really confusing when I hear parents talk about teachers who encourage their kids to transition. I'm thinking, why are the teachers involved in this in any way? The only thing that I can think of that even resembles that is when I was in 7th grade, I had hygiene issues. And I did have a teacher who pulled me aside and encouraged me to have better hygiene, kind of explain some of these issues to me. But otherwise, like I don't remember any other instances where teachers were that involved with students' personal lives, that they would actually like hide clothes for a child to change into at school so that this child could present one way at school and then go home and be another way.
That's right. I talk about this in my book because I interviewed teachers, and they really feel that they are protecting, that school is the safe haven. This is what they say: the school is the safe haven for an LGBTQ child, but home is an unsafe place, or is likely to be an unsafe place. That is the mantra, and it's certainly something that a lot of teachers seem to believe, and a lot of those guiding educational policy in this matter. And they are working very, very hard to undermine parents. Even, of course, my book, I interview mostly politically progressive parents. So these are not sort of people who are squeamish about LGBTQ generally, but they are terribly undermined, and in some cases even having their children alienated from them by a school system that was ostensibly there to take care of their children or educate them.
So where do we go from here? Do you have any suggestions as we finish up?
Sure. I have a few things. One, I think we have to remember why it's great to be a woman and make sure our daughters know that. These girls don't know. They don't know how wonderful it is to be a woman, how wonderful it is to, go through and have a romantic life. A lot of these girls make their decisions before they've even had a kiss. They don't know how wonderful, in-person friendships are with other women, and how close they can be, and how important their girlfriends are. And they don't know that, that the ability to have children is a remarkable asset, and not one they should be so quick to foreclose, which unfortunately too many of them are doing with these, hormones.
I'm glad you said that, because I remember, boy, it was up until probably mid-high school that I wanted my tubes tied. I wanted, there's no way I wanted kids. I don't really like kids. And the thought of having one of my own, just, ugh, I was not interested. And then lo and behold, I get married and I have a daughter, and I am in love with her in a way that I never thought I could fall in love with another person. And so I think it is so important to keep that option open, because when you're, 13, 14, 15, 16, you have no idea that one day you might decide that it is a phenomenal thing to have a baby.
That's exactly right. And you brought up another thing, which is that what they're going through right now, hating their bodies, not wanting to become women, the whole thing, it's perfectly normal. We need to reintroduce the concept of normal. Okay. It doesn't mean they're gender nonconforming. It doesn't mean they need to change their pronouns. They're just normal adolescent girls, some of whom have anxiety, some of whom have depression, some of whom may emerge as one day as straight or gay or whatever else. But for right now, they're just normal adolescent girls. And we've sort of lost the vocabulary for that.
Yeah, it would be really strange to have an adolescent girl who was perfectly comfortable going through puberty, was perfectly comfortable in her body, and perfectly comfortable with her role as an emerging woman. That would be really strange. Well,
You're
thank you
right.
so much for your time. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. I know how busy you
Sure.
are, and I just am excited about your book, and I thank you so much for writing it.
Thank you. It was great talking to you.
Nice to talk to you. Thanks.